Hi, friends, and welcome back to the BioHackers podcast. I'm your host, David James Clark IV, here with the Wizard of Workflows, the Genie of Genomics, Dr. Alex Feltus.
Hey, thank you, Dave. Once again, you're really doing a good job of saying what I told you to say. You're getting much better at it.
Well, these opening scripts that you keep sending me get weirder and weirder, but you know what? I'm more than happy to roll with the flow because you have so much to offer the show. Speaking of which, let's kick it off with the opening song. All right, now we're back. You know, today's episode is going to be really weird.
Cool.
I knew it was going to be weird when I saw some notes come back from our guest, who's a fascinating gentleman, and he was talking about quantum weirdness. And as soon as he started coining the term quantum weirdness, and I will be asking him about that, I knew it was going to be a really fun episode. Now, all along, we've been talking about these wonderful Renaissance men and women who have been joining the show. But you can think of Ken Matusow as a new Renaissance man. He's going to talk to us about the emergence of the new Renaissance, something that some people are calling psychohistory. So that in and of itself is going to be interesting. But my sense is it all comes down to one word, and that word is complexity.
Yes.
The idea that systems are incredibly complex, the world is incredibly complex. And you made this awesome observation earlier when we were talking about we spend all day trying to remove complexity from these systems.
Yes.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
I could give examples from that from all sorts of different perspectives, but from a computing perspective is one of the ones that I think about a lot. Is that we try to build computing systems like smartphones and computers, laptops to actually do computing. We make them as simple and straightforward as you can. And when they do that, they're boxed off where it's difficult to do things that are outside of the box or things that are complex.
Yep.
And so that's really heart of what we're trying to do with the biohacker community is liberate people and make them be able to speak the language of computing, have a computer that lets them do whatever they want and not what they're forced to do, which is good too, right? I don't want to write code to be able to, do this podcast, right? I want to just turn on the camera. But when you're dealing with data sets that are complex and big, you have to have the ability to be fluid and navigate all the data. This comes from analyzing complex systems, which everything is complex. As I get older, I get a little more set in my ways about things, which can be good and bad. But looking at genetics and things like that, a lot of people, and just biology in general, there's there's formal training, sometimes requirements to take a system and break it into its component parts and study the parts independently. I believe that you have to study things holistically, or at least break the giant system down into something, manageable. Like, don't study the universe, but study a galaxy. Don't study a galaxy, study a star. I can handle that. But you don't, trying to understand the universe by studying, an element on the periodic table, how it floats in space, and that kind of stuff. Which reductionist science is very powerful, but understanding and embracing complexity is how you do things. I think everybody understands weather, right? You go look at the weather forecast and you can see, hey, look, there's something coming towards me on the screen. And you can predict what's going to happen with it. Weather is a complex system. And what's coming on the screen on the weather report isn't going to happen, 2 weeks from now. It's going to change. It's an evolving system. And so, I'm a big believer and practicer of teaching people how to use computers to be able to analyze things the way they want and embrace complexity of large data sets, because that's the way the universe works.
Yes, great point.
Ken is a very interesting fellow. He thinks about things, I think, differently than most people do, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say about complex systems.
So I asked Ken, what are you? And of course, that garnered a very complex answer. But I'll whittle it down to a systems theorist. He's a physicist, a writer, an investor. we'll get a chance to meet him firsthand in a moment. But do you feel like this boxing in of technology, as you talked about, for compute systems, this also happens in science, is a little bit like trying to, mountain bike with training wheels, right? So you really are. Yeah. If you've ever bowled with guardrails, it just really stops you from doing unexpected things. Ken is going to talk about uncertainty and one of my favorite topics that I completely don't understand, and that is imaginary numbers. But using some of these complex and crazy weirdness, quantum weirdness, to explain complex systems, because uncertainty is everywhere around us. Yeah. And most of today's systems are designed to remove uncertainty. And we have to, as scientists, embrace uncertainty to really, truly understand, what's happening. Another thing he talked about, and we'll ask him, but I wanted to get your perspective first, is this idea that quantum mechanics can be used to help explain biological phenomenon. I think that's kind of this uncertainty thing. He's a quantum physicist of sorts. He's working with this guy, Marvin. He'll talk to us a little bit about that. So how do you think quantum mechanics can be used to explain the complexity of biological systems?
Yeah. So first of all, before we were here, after we're gone, the universe is still going to exist, and the universe exists the way it is. Yeah. And there's nothing weird about quantum mechanics. That's the way it is, and physicists have coined it that way, right? Or pushed it, branded it as something weird, but it's a fundamental, aspect of nature. And if you stop thinking about it being weird, I took quantum mechanics. I was like trying to follow the philosophical arguments of the teacher. When I stopped listening to that and just looked at the graphs, the outputs of the equations and all, it was like started to be common sense, right? All biological systems, everything is biochemical. It's built from, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur on the periodic table, CHNUPs, plus a few other things. And they are organized around quantum principles. That's how all chemistry starts. And I wonder, this is getting, as a working hypothesis, is that if everything truly is a fractal repeating pattern nature, that's scale free, if you go small or high, you see the same thing. Well, shouldn't those principles just be recapitulated, those patterns, at a higher level in biological systems? And I wonder if the biological systems, if you start modeling them as quantum, maybe not quantum systems, but the same patterns that come out of quantum systems, well, maybe you'll start to understand them, because there's definitely some organizing principles to biological systems that we don't know what they are. I wonder if they're not something we can ever understand. You just accept them, come up with some quantum models, quantum inspired models, if nothing else, and see if you can't, predict what's going to happen with the nuances of quantum mechanics. But, I don't know. I just wonder if there's things that we'll never be able to detect, like dark matter, organizing principles of biological systems that are there, but they're just not really part of our perception space. Yeah, like we can't see that. And so maybe this is this repeating pattern scale-free thing. The evidence for that is not completely wacky. It's that you look at repeating patterns of the atomic scale, and you see some of those things all the way up to the universe scale. Biological systems are, somewhere in between those 2 points. And, maybe that's how we should be approaching problems. And I know that quantum mechanics comes from, you can't break the system down into individual components. You have to look at the system. So it's already, that's, I don't know, maybe that's, I'll stop there.
That's fantastic. We could keep going, but we want to bring Ken onto the show. But that was wonderful. Thank you for helping explain, the relationship and the dynamic. And I completely agree that there are some elements of nature we should just accept and then move on, because again, Maslow's hierarchy, it's a pyramid, and we need to understand the base of the pyramid much better before we try and understand the tip of the pyramid, because these things are all interrelated. So let's bring on our friend Ken Matusow and see what he has to say about today's topic, psychohistory. Welcome back, biohackers. We're here with today's esteemed guest, Ken Matusow. How you doing today, Ken?
Pretty good, David.
All right. We're really excited about you and talking about these amazing complex systems, the quantum weirdness that that we discussed earlier, and many other rabbit holes. But first, we'd like to start with Alex introducing our guest. Alex?
Hey, yeah, so Ken is somebody I met. I mean, it's been over a decade, and Ken, I don't remember how we met. Do you remember how we met?
Yeah, we were. You were. You were much newer at Clemson then, and there was a professor I was working with
Yes.
on a project, and he brought you in.
He knew he was a friend of a friend, right? And so I'm on the East Coast, and he's on the West Coast, and we collaborate together on writing a National Science Foundation grant.
Yeah, that's right.
Ken has a long background in starting companies, doing the Silicon Valley thing, doing a lot of tech stuff. And he was working in his company, and I was working at a genomics facility, and we were going to do an exchange program between students and have them go do business analytics and genomic analytics back and forth. And so that's how I met Ken, and Ken has a long history, which hopefully I'll ask Ken to introduce himself, because he has a long history of different things in his past.
The only thing before we start there that I want to add is, again, you talk about the Silicon Valley South Carolina connection. Ken's responsible for connecting you and I, and thank you very much for that, Ken. You've been a mentor to Praxis and the BioHacker community from the beginning, and we couldn't be more excited to have you on the show. So let's start with, tell us about your story, because we love to hear these cool stories, how you got where you are, and hopefully part of that will inspire the biohackers who are listening.
Okay, let me start with your previous conversation where I hooked up with Alex. I hooked up with Alex, and then I met you, David, independently, and then I helped connect you guys together. And we've all done separate things together or with each other or different combinations. And this is a great example of how systems work. This is something you cannot really predict. You just got to go for it and see where things end up. The problem I see, and this will lead to an introduction of myself, is that the formalisms for understanding these kinds of complex systems really don't exist yet. It's just beginning. And my introduction to this whole area was, gee willikers. Boy, that's a statement that dates me.
Yeah, I love gee willikers. I haven't heard that one since Scooby-Doo.
Scooby-Doo, you got it. That was rough, 50 years ago, when I had just finished being an undergraduate. I went to University of Wisconsin in Madison with a math major, and I read a book called The Foundation Trilogy by Isaac Asimov.
Yeah.
And in the book, he describes this new kind of mathematics called psychohistory, and I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to study it. So I started asking around. No one taught the field because it didn't exist. At the University of Wisconsin, there was a interdisciplinary group called I forget. Well, we can edit that out. And I decided to study in graduate school in industrial engineering, which is basically applied mathematics, which seemed to be the closest match. As luck would have it, after the first semester, I drove back to Philadelphia to see my mother, and then was driving up to Rochester, New York to see my father. And smack in the middle is Binghamton, New York, where one of the books I read my first semester was written by one of the professors there, called George Clear. I pulled off the freeway, looked his name up in the phone book. He invited me over, and I transferred.
Oh my gosh, what a story. That was unpredictable. That was uncertain.
That's a good example of this. And my master's degree is in a field called general systems theory. I'm one of the very few people with a degree like that in the world. There's only, I believe, one degree program in systems science offered now in the United States, which is at Portland State University, which I'll be visiting in just a couple of weeks. Anyway, there were no jobs for systems theorists, so I got a job in a relatively new field back then called computer science, and I became a programmer and moved to Silicon Valley, got involved really early on in some of the fundamental developments. A company I was with, we built the first multiprocessor system for a chip tester. We're the guys that integrated TCP/IP into the Unix kernel. And after that, I started my own company called Detente Technology. We did a lot of operating system work and embedded systems work. We actually did a prototype which became the operating system for this iPhone here.
Oh my gosh! You're the father of the iPhone operating system. That's impressive.
If I want to exaggerate a whole lot, I could say yes, but that's not really accurate. It was just a proof of concept, which was the port of the Mach operating system, which was the Next operating system at the time for Next Computer, to a Spark platform for Sun. It worked, and Steve Jobs took that, went to Apple, and the rest is history. I sold the company off to Cadence Design in the late 90s, made a bunch of money and semi-retired and started doing consulting, investing. I later became a travel writer. I'm a world traveler. I've been to over 80 countries, and I don't know, about 10, 12 years ago, I started attending a class at Stanford taught by Lenny Susskind, very famous physicist there. And he piqued my interest in systems after a hiatus of 40 years or so. And for the last number of years, my main focus has been trying to understand complex systems. And this came out of my study of physics with Lenny Susskind, and that's where I am right now.
Wow. That's fantastic. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, there's lots of other threads to Ken's past that he's not mentioning that are equally interesting. He's an interesting fellow. That's why it's hard to introduce. It's hard to introduce Ken. He needs to do it himself.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic story. I love the whole randomness, the perceived randomness and uncertainty and the complexity of your path, from the Foundation trilogy, which is near and dear to our hearts. The TV show font is the Praxis font. We really love the concept of psychohistory and the idea around non-reductionist science, which we'll talk about in just a second. But Ken, where would you like to start? I know we talked a little bit about the new Renaissance and about all the instability that's happening in the world right now across, political, art, science, technology landscapes, and how it mimics something that happened 400 years ago. Would you like to kick it off with that?
Yeah, I think that's a good intro. I happen to see the world right now is going through massive changes. I think we all agree, and people are struggling to try to understand where it's going. It seems to be going in arbitrary, uncertain directions. I'll bring up uncertainty again, and this has happened in the past. And as a systems theorist, I try to bring together many disciplines together. And I think this could be exemplified by taking a quick look at the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, which are very much connected to each other. Roughly 500 years ago, 400 to 600 years ago, Europe, which to that point was really a backwater in world history, started the Renaissance. It was engendered potentially by the trade, which Florence headed up, the invasion of the Mongols prior to the Renaissance in medieval Europe. To cut a long story short, around that time, a new kinds of thought developed. There were a couple of inventions that changed how people related to each other. One of the key ones was double entry bookkeeping. It's a simple thing, but that was what enabled capitalism to really be able to take off. Related to that was the development of a modern corporation. This formed, in my thinking, the basis of capitalism. Also, back in that part of Europe, the notion of a city-state really didn't exist. Florence was an independent entity, as with Venice, Rome, Milan, etc., constantly fighting with each other. The idea of an abstract political entity called Italy did not exist until a few hundred years after that. One of the ways these things came together was Florence was ruled by the Medicis, which were bankers, not kings or princes, which is traditionally who ran things. They were a republic, which again has existed for many years, but this time that idea caught fire and it's taken over the world. The whole world now is chopped into political zones called nation states. Besides the economic and political aspects of the Renaissance, of course, there's the artistic part of it, which everybody's familiar with, and also the scientific part of it. That's, in those days, science was called natural history. That's evolved into what we call science. And the idea of science is predicated on the idea that things that happen in nature are inherently predictable. Okay, and scientists such as the early scientists such as Kepler and Copernicus started establishing some basic principles. Galileo took that, marched it forward, and finally Isaac Newton in the late 17th century was able to take these general ideas and quantify them. He connected the quantification by using mathematics and attaching mathematics to what was previously sort of philosophical thoughts. And that caused a revolution, okay? And the world we see now is a result of all this. We live in a world where capitalism dominates, a world of city-states driven by science and technology, and these are reflected in the arts. I'll give you one example of how these different aspects are intimately connected. Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity within a couple of months of Pablo Picasso painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which art historians, I used to be a art historian as well, by the way, guys.
Oh my gosh, let's add it to the list.
And so I got myself through grad school. I taught arts history classes. Anyway, but both Einstein and Picasso said exactly the same thing, albeit in different kinds of languages. So my thought is that where we artificially cut the world up into different disciplines such as science, art, politics, economics, what have you, these are really all manifestations of a deeper truth. And it's the quest to find that truth, which is what drives me to do what I do. And one of the things I believe that's missing now is that mathematics, which forms a lot of the basis of our science, is not fully developed to understand a world that is both non-reductionist and non-deterministic, which is understandable since the idea of determinism and reductionism is what science is ultimately based upon.
Yep.
And just way to throw in there, that's the way we train people. That's the way I was trained, that way, to be reductionist. We're trained the opposite of holism.
Let's take a piece of literature, Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which is one of the more inscrutable pieces of literature ever written, if you ever try to read it. The reductionist deterministic way of studying that would be to get the world's greatest professor in the letter A and the world's greatest professor with the letter B up to Z and lock them in a room and tell me, what is this book about? And that just doesn't make any sense, obviously. But that is increasingly the challenge that we're facing. We're starting to deal with problems so complicated and so interconnected, the usual reductionist and deterministic methodologies are not working all that well. And that's where my focus is.
Fantastic. I'll tell you, we had another biohacker on an earlier podcast, Reed Bender, who is finding a way to connect bioinformatics and sound and yoga. And again, trying to be interdisciplinary, like you're talking about, art and technology and the body into a much more holistic approach. So that really rings true for what you're saying. So tell us a little bit about this this concept. I think you and Marvin, you're going to introduce Marvin in a second, and Alex worked on this idea that quantum mechanics really has a play in explaining the complexity of biological systems. Tell us what that's all about, because it sounds like you're starting to explore that in much more depth now, and you've even developed some, or helped co-develop some technology and some models around that.
Yeah, and this started with Alex, by the way. One day Alex called me up and said, I have a problem. The human genome has roughly 60,000 genes. I think 20,000 code for proteins. The other 40 do other things. And we know what these genes do individually, but when we put them together, they behave differently than the genes apart. So there may be 60,000 genes, but there's a lot more combinations of genes. And one of the problems people have with systems theory is they do not appreciate the large numbers that come from combinatorics. The total number of combinations of 60,000 genes, whether it's 2 genes together or 3 or 4 or 5 or all 60,000, is 60,000 factorial, which is approximately a 1 with 60,000 zeros after it. That's a rather large number.
Yeah, I would say.
You can compare it, the number of atoms in the universe, not stars, but atoms, is a 1 with only 80 zeros after it. So the idea of trying to track down every possible combination of genes is impossible. It's just not computationally feasible. So Alice came to me with that problem and says, do you have any idea how we could possibly provide an analysis without looking at each possible combination of gene? In other words, he was asking, is there a non-reductionist approach to understanding this phenomenon? So in my research in mathematics and physics and other fields, I've come to the conclusion that in modern mathematics, modern science, there's really one major algorithm that's been developed that deals with non-reductionist and non-deterministic systems, and that is the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And that's a controversial statement. Many people will disagree with it. I'd be happy to argue the point with them. But to prove the point, I went to my friend Marvin Weinstein, a physicist at Stanford University. He ran SLAC for 40 years. That was his toy, and he played with it. And
the Stanford Linear Accelerator, just for the use out there, that's absolutely amazing piece of machinery.
It's incredible. And so he's retired now. He's professor emeritus, and he wanted to take the mathematical models he used to understand the collisions in his accelerator and see if they could be applied to other areas. I connected him to Alex, and the first thing we tried to do, and really Alex and Marvin worked together. I was in the background at this point. They tried to find a problem where they could apply his algorithm to see if it made sense. And they picked cancer. They had a database of roughly 2,000 cancer patients with 5 different cancers. They had the genetic profile in this case, they used RNA and not DNA, RNA transcripts, and they wanted to see if they could use quantum mechanics to understand how these genes worked and how cancer was expressed by the various, in this case, RNA combinations. And what Marvin did, he took each of the 2,000 data points and treated it as a particle, a subatomic particle. And what he did, attached to each of those data points, he attached fuzziness in terms of a probability distribution. In other words, this data point may be a 5, but maybe it's a 4 or a 6 or a 3. And he created a wave function, which is the basic building block of quantum mechanics. So he treated it as 2,000 particles and wanted to see how they interacted. And he just used the exact equations of quantum mechanics, in this case the Schrodinger equation, and used pure physics-related rules of behavior and came up with a solution that seemed to work pretty well. And Alice can speak to the success or failure of that experiment. Alex?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because it gave us, so this is published work. It's in scientific reports, and if anybody wants to read it, but it was interesting to see the relationships of the system between the points, right, between the gene products for these 5 cancer types. And you would see clustering of cancer types that, from a multidimensional perspective, right, the entire system, that made sense. And we're able to find out the features, the genes that were within that system. We went reductionist again and pulled out some of these genes. And then we looked to see what they did collectively, use some standard bioinformatics tools, functional enrichment analysis, for anybody out there. And everything made sense. But it's really interesting because it kind of stopped there. And I think because there are other, in academia, there's other places to go and other projects we're working on and everything. But the actionability of it, because, we pull out a subsystem, how do you test that further? It just became so complicated that we just sort of, you divert off path of least resistance to other projects, right? But I never really felt like I understood the potential of it and the utility of it. Not that it isn't there, because I very, very much believe in this, but it didn't drop out the smoking gun for cancer. It just gave us an idea that this approach does seem to give insights that make sense, at least from a gut feeling perspective, or what's already known in the literature about some of these genes.
And I think it's a perfect characterization of it, Alex. It didn't create any aha. There was one aha moment, I think, when you identified 48 transcripts that were connected to the cancers. You took out the 48 transcripts expecting to see noise, and you still saw the cancers somewhere embedded inside the system.
Well, that led to a different thing. I don't know where this rabbit hole is going, but yeah, what it did do was, and I see this with any kind of multidimensional approach for analyzing, how close two samples are, like measuring the genes, is that it's, if you start, we realized that you took these out and you would start to see the impact of them on clustering, but it made me realize that if I start taking out random genes at a certain number, I start to see, or I start adding back in genes, start to see clusters, no matter what genes I choose. So this showed me that in this particular data set, that if I were to choose, I think it was like 150 genes, then I would start to see the clustering of the samples into what made sense, into the cancer subtypes. And so it gave me the insight into this. We started calling this background classification potential. We published this using other machine learning techniques to be able to see this, where it showed me that it didn't really matter. And maybe this is a good point for you to try to explain this. It didn't really matter at a point what genes you chose. That they're associated, or they have enough power to cluster the samples together. And so I still don't know if those genes that we found through the DQC method are they more enriched for causality or association, or being able to discriminate different groups. But this is something I see over and over again in plant and animal systems, and this has very profound impact on biomarkers for saying that these genes are associated with that trait, that cancer, that drug treatment or whatever, that you could, at a point when you start to get holistic, you can pull out 150 genes and get the result you're looking for. So either everything's association and you can group things with random genes, or the entire system is what's important. There is no smoking gun. There is no subsystem. And so just by pulling out random things, you're able to discriminate between groups, which is great to tell you've got this cancer, that cancer. but the patient doesn't care about that. They want to get cured. So how you turn that into, how do we, disrupt the system? I mean, do you have to disrupt the entire system? And there are plenty of cases where you see components that you can disrupt them and fix or destroy the system. But like when you start talking about cancer and things like that, I wonder, there's always this concept of the silver bullet, which I never believed. And this doesn't make any sense. Or do you need a silver shotgun pellets? Or, do you need, to be able to manipulate the entire system? You know what I mean? Like, so what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're highlighting the real key point. And the way I would describe that key point is that there's enough science there to establish something is going on, but that's about it.
Yes.
And the
well said.
The key point is that we do not yet have the formal tools needed to dig much deeper. The current state of mathematics or computational biology just haven't matured enough in order to go down that path. And the reason is simple, because you're dealing with systems that are non-reductionist, non-deterministic, and mathematics is not real equipped for those kind of systems. And
we're also dealing with systems too that the time component is lost, because it's usually destructive sampling. So you have to, somebody got a tumor when they're 30, it grew slowly, and then they got detected when they're 70. And we get to see a snapshot of that tumor at 70 at the endpoint, and we don't get to go measure it back in time. So we have the time component is missing from almost all biological measurements, just to throw that out there.
Yeah, because you have an experiment, and when the experiment is done, it's finished, and then you have to do another one. It's hard to connect them together
on a different sample, right? I mean, you can't put a frog in a blender, study it, and then go put the resurrect the frog. It doesn't work. You have to get a different frog, and people get around that problem by finding a frog with the same genetic background, to try to have the same initialization state when the zygote forms and grows into another frog. But that's a different frog.
Right, but another approach would be to build a better blender.
Yeah.
So
stop blending frogs.
That's the tricorder, right? The magic Star Trek tricorder. We
exactly.
do non-destructive sampling. We have functional MRIs and things like that, but nothing at the molecular scale.
But I think this seriously, this problem is the problem that I and other people are trying to help solve. Again, there needs to be, I think, some fundamental new mathematics developed in order to begin to attack your problem. And I'm working on 3 ideas, 3 papers. One's called Uncertainty, which describes uncertainty as a formal branch of mathematics. The next one I call Nentropy, which stands for normalized entropy. And the third one I call Predicate, which describes logical predicates and how it may be useful to expand their definition a bit in order to encompass these new kind of systems. And these 3 papers together, I call the 3 foundational papers. I call my own foundation trilogy, by the way.
Foundation.
Embedded pun there.
Foundation 22. Yeah,
exactly.
No,
Isaac's turning over in his grave.
So you're a writer in addition to an investor and a scientist.
I'm a generalist. I do everything a little bit.
Yeah.
But anyway,
mile wide and an inch deep. But I would say with you, it's more than an inch deep. I just wanted to interject that for those of you listening, and if there's any biohackers out there who are interested in trying to take some of this research to the next level, help us develop, maybe some new models, et cetera, I'm going to put the links to these papers, not necessarily Ken's papers till they're done, but the link to the paper, Alex, that you and Marvin and Ken published in the description, because sure. I think there's some really interesting science in there. And as you guys have theorized, there's some tremendous potential, but we're going to need a new blender or a tricorder in order to, potentially take it to the next level. Sorry, Ken, I don't want to interrupt. So tell me about these 3 papers, the new Foundation trilogy.
Okay, the first paper is called Uncertainty, And in uncertainty, I try to make the case that, there is no field of uncertainty theory in mathematics, so I'm trying to lay a foundation for that. I don't claim to be a mathematician, although I have some background in mathematics, obviously. Again, it's written as a systems theoretical paper, not a math or a science paper. In it, I try to analyze system uncertainty, and in it, I try as like an example of how to utilize system uncertainty. I look at a classic problem in physics, which is, I'm not sure how they characterize it. It's how they measure spin. When you measure spin on a subatomic particle, if you measure the spin along its axis of rotation, you can measure the spin 100% correctly all the time. If it's anti-parallel, your answers are 100% incomplete. And if it's perpendicular to the plane of the spin, you're right half the time. And what physicists do, they will set the particle with spin up and see if they can measure it in these different planes. And that makes common sense. It gets a little odd when you put the angle at 45 degrees. Common sense dictates you would get a correct answer 75% of the time, or what's the other one? 25% of the time if it's in the other direction. But that's not the way it works. The way it works is you get the correct answer 85% of the time if it's 45 degrees in this direction, and only 15% here. And physicists have been trying to figure out why for, about 50 years now. The paper that really described it was published in the 1960s by a guy named John Bell. In my paper, I try to show that the quantum mechanics, the mathematics of quantum mechanics gets it right because, unbeknownst to physicists, the mathematics of quantum mechanics incorporates the notion of uncertainty. In this example, the uncertainty is embedded within what we would call the imaginary component of a complex number.
Imaginary numbers. I was waiting to. I was waiting.
Imaginary
to playing
numbers.
A drinking game. Every time you say imaginary numbers, I have to take a shot.
Let me ask you a question.
So you're sober.
Okay, David. What is 2 squared?
We know that 2 squared is 4.
And what is negative 2 squared?
Also 4.
So what's the square? Well, we know the square root of 4 is either 2 or negative 2. What is the square root of negative 4?
An imaginary number.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's been treated as a throwaway piece of mathematics. The paper I wrote and a paper Alex just sent me shows that the imaginary component of like an equation has real measurable effects on an experiment. And that's what I try to show in my paper. That
Fantastic.
The reason the answer is 85% instead of 75 is strictly because of the imaginary component, which in my paper is a formal. The magnitude of the imaginary vector is a description of the amount of uncertainty in the system. And it is irreducible in this case. You cannot get rid of it, even theoretically. So that's paper number 1. And that's necessary.
Ask a question about it before you go on to 2. So the imaginary numbers, maybe this is too simple way of saying it, was basically a hack, right? To make things work. Like when you needed to do some math and you couldn't do that, they had to come up with a hack. But it turns out that your idea is that the hack is something that's physical.
Is real.
Yeah, it is a hack, and it's always been considered a hack. And nobody, I mean, what can you do with an imaginary number? It doesn't really exist.
Yeah,
and people haven't really spent a lot of time pondering it. But again, I happen to find an example where it makes a difference. If the
imaginary hack is predictable, then it's not a hack anymore.
No, it is not a hack, and this is why quantum mechanics works so well. Quantum mechanics is the most empirically evaluated theory ever developed by humans. It's been shown to be correct to 10 decimal places. To this day, physicists are kind of bewildered by the odd mathematics of it and some of its so-called odd behavior.
Quantum weirdness.
Quantum weirdness, they call it. I happen to think there is no such thing as quantum weirdness. It's just quantum weirdness is a direct result of trying to shape and force a non-deterministic, non-reductionist reality into a reductionist, deterministic model. It doesn't quite work.
We're weird, but nature isn't.
Yeah, that's right.
No, well, again, just determinism. Science has worked so well, and it is the world. This podcast is a result of science, reductionist, deterministic thinking. It is essential for the development of our planet, but it's not everything. All I'm trying to say is some systems you need to get beyond that, but we don't have the tools to do that. That's what I'm trying to develop. Okay.
Are we getting there? Are we getting
slowly,
those tools? I mean,
but it's going to be difficult. And going back to the original thesis, circling back to that again, what I believe is a lot of these new technologies engendered by science, as manifested by the internet and people flying all over the world all the time, the development of economies. There is relatively little poverty in the world compared to any time in the past, or hunger, or overt disease. We have more control over environment than we ever had before. But there's a but. Just as the Renaissance engendered an enormous change in all the institutions, I believe we're going through the same thing now. And right now, our society, and it includes the political, economic, scientific, artistic, you name it, is highly unstable right now, and it will find a new stability point, but we don't know what it is. And as a result, people are up in the air. The COVID, Ukraine war, climate change, you name it. People are reacting differently today than in the past, and I think this is a manifestation. Again, I believe in underlying systems causing this. There's an underlying change in paradigm, and in order to live in this new world, we have to develop the tools to do so. That's what I'm trying to humbly do. Okay.
Yeah. And so are we, by the way. I mean, go ahead, Alex.
Oh, no, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to take that to the next level. I mean, I think you're talking about the new Renaissance, and we need new tools to interact with this instability that's happening. I completely agree, with your assessment. And thank you, by the way, for bringing in, the 500-year-old history lesson, because, history repeats itself. And if you're not if you don't study, the mistakes made by those before you, you're doomed to repeat them. And so, we need these new systems, and one of those systems is education. And today we've been talking a lot about science and about some new non-deterministic, non-reductionist approaches to complex systems as kind of new science to help us understand things like cancer and climate change and weather and all of that. But that really sits on the foundation. Standing on the shoulders of giants, sits on the foundation of education. And we're trying to, in effect, develop a new system where science education is available to everybody. It's very experiential. You can, get access to these complex digital tools and skills very easily. And then you get credentialed and you get a good job and you can contribute. And that's anybody, not just the people who are, fortunate enough to go through the traditional higher education system.
And that is a direct outgrowth of the Renaissance. If you go back to the founding fathers and some of the philosophical foundations of the United States, guys like Thomas Locke, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, these guys developed the idea of a social contract where there's a relationship between a political entity and the governed. Okay. I forget where I was going with.
Oh, that higher education is a result of the
Yeah.
Renaissance.
Oh, yeah.
And now we're disrupting it.
Yeah, and one of the institutions that really has not evolved from the Renaissance is education. It basically is the same as it was 500 years ago, where you have a university and you have masters, which are called professors, and you have apprentices, which do work for free, which are called graduate students now, and it's basically the same thing. And it's time for a change. And just my own self as an example, I have not formally studied very much mathematics or physics. It's mostly all self-learned through some lectures with Lenny Susskind and talking to him, and YouTube and Wikipedia and things like that. I am, in terms of education, I am an example of a new man. Okay, and if my work has any validity, it's a proof point for this new approach to education. Because I'm not formally trained in any of these things.
You're a citizen
Imagine
scientist.
the difference.
Yeah.
Citizen
It's like the old
scientist,
days.
thank you, Alex. You talk about that all the time. And imagine, Ken, if you make a profound contribution to, the breakthroughs that we need in this new science, and you do it as someone who has no formal education, no formal training in those areas, but you've been, part of these experiential collaborative community citizen science, experiences like a biohackathon, like virtual training, like digital credentials, all the types of things that we're trying to throw into the mix.
But he does. Ken's brain is Ken's brain, right? But Ken did get trained in complex systems theory, right? So
Yes.
from a formal education perspective, right? But I wonder how much of that, reading foundation series, things like that happen in your life, and that training that you got, which I didn't have. I was trained purely reductionist science, right? And if I had been trained at least even conceptually to look at it holistically, and you actually had formal training in it, maybe that's the magic. Maybe we can have more people thinking like you do with formal education, but just coming at it with a systems perspective, right? Which I guess you get in engineering on some level, right? Or is that not true?
Well, that's the sad thing. There was when I was going to school, there was a field of systems science, but it has since pretty much disappeared. That's what I see as a major tragedy of today's age. Again,
but why did it disappear? It's so important.
People just didn't see it being valuable. One of the things that I studied a lot in grad school was a thing called fuzzy set theory, which is an extension of formal set theory, where instead of elements being a member of the set, they're probably a member of the set, but they're not quite sure. And they used fuzzies. Had a lot of excitement back in the 1970s, and I think some company made an elevator using fuzzy set theory to figure out which floor to go to. I'm not sure, but it didn't make a very big impression on the world, and it got overtaken by traditional science, and rightly so, because it wasn't developed enough in order to be all that useful, where traditional science was. But I think it's important for the world to catch up.
Interesting.
And in order to catch up, new mathematics has to be discovered, and I don't see that happening very much today. If I could just spur that on, the stuff I'm doing, again, I'm not claiming to be a mathematician. The papers are mathematical. There's equations all over, like other papers. But physicists are not mathematicians either, and they write papers full of equations, and it's accepted. Not to the same type of quality that a mathematician would, but I think systems theory needs the same thing. So I'm trying to establish that as a criterion.
Interesting.
But the purpose of all this stuff is really to foster the idea of system science rather than any particular theory or anything. It needs to come back if we're going to be able to handle all the new events in the world. We have to begin to be able to think in a modern way, which means non-reductionist and non-deterministic, but we need to have the formal tools. Newton invented calculus in order to show his calculations of physics. Systems theorists have developed similar kinds of mathematics. So one of these is uncertainty, which I described to you. The next one I think is necessary is a much better description of what this thing called entropy is. And I'll take just a few minutes to talk about that. Entropy is this mysterious notion that no one quite knows what it is. People, physicists, mathematicians will describe it as uncertainty, whatever, things of that nature. It was used originally in the 19th century to describe thermodynamics and how steam engines behave. In a steam engine, you have zillions of particles bouncing off the side of the piston, and that's what causes pressure. But you don't want to study pressure by looking at every individual molecule bouncing around, and it makes no sense. So they aggregate it, and they call that pressure, and they develop this idea of entropy in order to relate concepts such as pressure and volume and temperature and things like that. It was further resigned in 1948 by a guy named Claude Shannon, who developed the mathematics called information theory, where he said entropy can also describe information, which is also kind of a amorphous concept. What is it? I don't know. So I have another description of entropy, which I'll describe to you. It just is a measure of the shape of a distribution, probability distribution. So let me give you a brief example. If you have a coin, if it's 50-50, it's a uniform distribution. It's very undecided what outcome will happen if you flip it. If it's a altered coin with two heads, it's called a uniform distribution. In that case, there's 100% of getting ahead if you flip it. If it's a fair coin, it's 50%. And if one side is heavier, if the head side is heavier, you'll get more heads than tails. It's hard to tell by how much. So the shape of a distribution, a probability distribution, is important, but there's no real way of describing it. So the way I would describe a coin is you just multiply the two probabilities together. 50-50 is 5 times 5 is 25. 60-40 is 6 times 4. 24. 7 times 3 is 21, and so forth. So the higher the multiplication of the two probabilities, the flatter the distribution is. The more, it's called a uniform distribution, where every probability is the same. So that can be generalized. For a die, you can multiply all 6 heads of the die together. But there's a problem. A uniform distribution would be you get a 1 chance in 6 of getting any one of the 6 sides. A degenerate solution, which is a deterministic solution, is there's 100% you get one of the sides, and a 0% you get the other 5 sides. But the algorithm doesn't quite work, because you may have a situation where two sides, one side is 0 and the other sides are all 20%. It adds up to 1, so it's a valid probability distribution, but it's not a degenerate distribution, yet it does add up to 0, multiply up to 0. So to solve that problem, instead of multiplying the probabilities together, you add the log of the probabilities. You don't care what the number is, you just care how relatively high it is. That is a problem too, because the log of 0 does not exist. So to get around that, you multiply the log of 0 by 0. So now the equation is summation of p log of p, which is a negative number. So you want to make it positive, you put a negative sign in front of it. And the way of describing a probability distribution is negative summation p log of p. That is the exact equation of entropy. So that is what I would describe. And it's a very concrete, measurable thing. There's nothing mystical or odd about it. And if you take the entropy and divide by the maximum entropy, which I call normalized entropy or nentropy, that is a description of the flatness of a probability distribution. And I would describe science as the process of transforming a uniform distribution into a degenerate distribution where there is one answer that's certain. And in terms of the probability distributions, what science does, it basically tries to bring the entropy of the system down to zero. Those are the ones that are most amenable to scientific investigation. So again, we need to understand that this non-reductionist, non-deterministic reality is the basic way things are. A deterministic system, reductionist one, is a special case of that.
Oof.
You know,
that hurt my brain.
That can hurt your brain a lot. That goes. It's like, you know, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons a lot, and I had a dice bag with lots of different kind of dice in it. Right. I even had a 3-sided die for my Mork and Mindy set, which is actually,
that's impressive. Thank you for going back.
It had
going back to Mork and Mindy.
2 1s, 2 2s, and 2 3s.
Secrets are coming out now, huh?
Yeah, no, these aren't secrets. I'm very, very proud of these things.
I know, I'm teasing.
But that's, you know, that's so, and I say that not completely as a joke, but like, you know, I have a probability distribution of, you know, typically 20,000 measurements of genes, 20,000 dyes, right? I think. So I actually, and we analyze, go down to one gene and look at a distribution of that across different samples, different tumors, say, and normal one, and try to compare these distributions of things, right? But that what you're talking about with entropy, that's a univariate, one-dimensional example, correct? Because like, what do you do when you have, you know, lots of different kinds of dyes, and you know, if I have 20,000 dice in my dice bag, and they're all different types, like where I don't know how to think about the problem. And this is I think is a really important point, is that I know what you're saying. I've talked about this stuff with you for years and years, and I kind of get what you're talking about, but I don't know how to go back and implement it. And a lot of times there's a big barrier with the math, right? A huge barrier with the math. I mean, I solved Schrodinger equations, right? Back in the day. I remember like nothing really from that point, where I can barely do calculus anymore. So how do you deal with that barrier of like, you know, translation of, sure, think about it on a systems level, which I preach, but then the actual tools you're talking about developing, how do you get them in the hands of professional and citizen scientists?
Yeah, I don't think the tools really exist yet. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of it. The first step is to understand there is a need for it. A lot of people think math is finished, the way physicists thought physics was finished in the late 19th century. They didn't think there was anything more to discover. Now they realize they forgot about 99% of it.
Yeah, I think the imaginary stuff.
No. In physics, quantum mechanics.
Yep.
All this stuff, you know, without quantum mechanics, a transistor couldn't exist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all this stuff, this podcast, the microphone I'm using, the computer, everything we have here is dependent on this technology. So we don't know where it's going to go, but that's why I'm saying there needs to be a foundational set of tools developed in order to get where you want to get to, Alex. It doesn't exist yet. I'm spending a lot of time working with, well, you guys know working with Ingvar to try to find practical examples of how we can apply this kind of stuff. So one of the things we're working on now is some of this new blockchain type technology, which is very much related to a lot of this. And this is for a different discussion, but I've just, between the three of it, you know, I've worked with Ingvar trying to come up with concrete examples of this, because Ingvar is also a systems guy. We are like we're like one, and we can finish each other's thoughts about this kind of stuff. And he's a rare bird. Go ahead.
What's Ingvar's last name? I'm sorry, we're saying Ingvar.
Tronstad,
yeah.
Yeah, look him up, everybody. Ingvar Tronstad. He's amazing.
Oh, this is going to be on the podcast. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I think you're right, Alex. And how to apply this? We don't quite know. Using the math of quantum mechanics is a bit of a hack, but it seems to work. But it's not the final solution, if you'll pardon the expression. There's a lot of other technologies that need to be developed. I think what it did do, it was an existence proof that it is possible to use this non-reductionist, non-deterministic algorithm in order to better understand biological systems. And again, as you rightly stated, the analysis didn't find any causality, it just found correlations.
Well, there could be causality in some of the genes we found. I just don't know to test that.
That's my point, is that that experiment did not lead to this causes that. It just says if you have these 48 transcripts, there's a high likelihood you're going to have cancer compared to if you don't have the structure of RNA. That's all you've shown.
And so I think I can net this out by saying that, your theories are the beginning. I mean, that's the whole subject matter of psychohistory in Foundation was these are some theories. Now we need to develop the tools and the science to be able to implement and apply these theories, right, to solve some big problems.
Well,
and so,
but before you do that, you have to invent psychohistory, which isn't invented yet. I'm just providing some very, very primitive tools that somebody else can take us there to lead us to that promised land.
And that somebody else, by the way, is exactly where I was going, which is those of you listening to this podcast right now,
Exactly.
You're the biohacker community. If any of you are interested in math, if any of you, are interested in trying to find, like Ken just said, primitive tools to help apply this cool new Nentropy concept to Alex's 20,000 gene conundrum, then please dive in, contact us, check out prxai.com. Also, as these papers are produced, we will make sure to send out a note to everybody, put them in the description, etc. So we want to try and get as many people involved in solving this problem as possible. But Ken, really, I think your 3 foundation papers, and we're about to get to the 3rd one, are the beginning. They are the foundation of the whole.
Scratching the surface.
Yeah, scratching the surface.
Yes.
So briefly tell us about number 3.
Number 3 is still not fully developed yet, and it's called Predicate. And it's the idea that our notion of predicate really is hindering us a lot. A lot of people believe statements are either true or false, which makes sense. Is that statement true or is it false? That every statement is true or false?
It is false.
That's a good one.
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, because of uncertainty.
Yeah, well, let me give you an example of that. There was a very famous theorem developed by a guy named Kurt Gödel in 1930s. He showed that any mathematical statement, meaning you have equations with numbers and equal signs and letters and stuff like that, that you can create statements, and these statements can be analyzed. And he showed, which was an amazing thing. A lot of people think this is one of the great inventions of the 20th century. He showed that there are statements that he can prove. Well, he can't prove. He can show they are neither true nor false using normal logic, okay, which is based on modern set theory. Okay, and there's certain examples of that. I can give you an example, a very simple example. I'm going to state a sentence of 4 words. This sentence is false. Is that sentence true? If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true. What is it?
My brain hurts.
It does. This stuff is brain-hurting material.
Yeah.
And so one of the most famous examples of this is a famous problem in mathematics called the continuum hypothesis. And the question is, how many integers are there? like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to wherever. It's infinite.
Google.
It's bigger than Google. Google is one to the 100th power. It's even bigger than a Googleplex, which is 1 to the Google power. It is infinite. Okay, and how many real numbers are there? That's also infinite. Well, what mathematicians in the late 19th century, George Cantor and others, proved is that these two infinities are different sizes. The number of integers or natural numbers, that infinity is called aleph naught, or sometimes it's referred to as countably infinite. The number of real numbers is called C, or uncountably infinite. And then they discovered there's an infinite number of infinities. Of course, they don't answer which infinity is that is infinite, but you get the idea. It brain-numbing stuff, basically.
Yeah, to infinity and beyond.
So they showed that the number of integers or natural numbers, it's the same infinity, and that's the smallest infinity you could have. The continuum hypothesis says the number of reals is the second smallest infinity. Okay? And Gödel himself proved you cannot prove that to be false. Okay? 30 years later, another mathematician proved you cannot prove it to be true. He didn't prove it false. He just said it can't be proven true and it can't be proven false. So mathematicians, they say, we don't know, it's indecidable, or it's inconsistent with modern set theory, which is called ZFC. I won't go into the details. And it's a conundrum that bothers people to this day. And I will expand the notion of a predicate to give a definite answer to that continuum hypothesis. And that would be, instead of a single Boolean variable being either true or false, you have a binary pair of Boolean variables. The first one, it's true. The second one, it's false. Okay. Most statements we know, it's either true or false. So it's either a 1, 0, or a 0, 1. It's consistent. But the continuum hypothesis is a 0, 0. So in this expanded domain of logic, there's nothing inconsistent with it or odd about it. It's just a different state of reality. If you think that everything is either true or false, that can be reduced to a conjecture that in this extended reality of two binary true and falses, that the exclusive OR is equal to 1, which means either 1, 0 or 0, 1. That's exclusive OR is equal to 1, 0, 0, or 1, 1. The exclusive OR is equal to 1. So here's a way of just slightly expanding your domain, and this weird intractable problem disappears. Okay.
Interesting.
So these are the three foundational papers I want to create. The first one's pretty much done. The second one is mostly done. The third one's just started. But I think these three papers together can create a foundation for building what could become eventually psychohistory. And that'll give us the ability to manipulate this new kind of reality. The way I visually describe it, we look at a running person, a scientist couched in traditional science tries to take it, turn it into a simple stick figure so we understand the basic motions of the legs and stuff. This new way of thinking would turn that into a pulsating glob of colors and shapes and movement and dynamism and stuff like that. We have the mathematics and the tools for dealing with the simple stick figure model, but not this other model. We need this other kind of mathematics in order to do that. I'm not going to be able to do that. This is way beyond my skills, but I can create a couple of ideas and hopefully just ask some questions that the younger people, the people that are watching this, can answer. And if I can get one or two excited about system science and say, oh, this is really interesting, because the people that get interested in system science are going to be people like the old mathematicians, Newton, physicist really, mathematician, Leibniz, you name it, Galois, Cantor. People today have the ability to create basic mathematics that'll be the foundation of this new reality. If I was a student, I would be pretty excited about being able to do that.
And I'm just kind of bringing it back to, as wrapping up here, to Alex's classes and the BioHacker community. I know, Alex, you have a little systems biology in your praxis journeys. You always talk about looking at the holistic approach to things. You've also talked about building a whole systems biology course. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? What would that look like?
It'll look like a lot of different things blended together. There's lots of little tools that we have that people can look at from a systems perspective that you can blend them together and make a systems biology course. It's kind of hard to explain what that is because it's a very complicated quilt, I guess. But some of the tools are things like I've noticed this in the last few years. I mean, it can actually. We were published with the DQC paper. We used a multidimensional visualization tool called TSNE, which allowed you to, for the first time, to look at, not for the first time, but for me, my lab, really, the first time to look at a lot of visualize complex multidimensional relationships between different points, in addition to the principal component analysis, which has been around for a long time. And these are some tools that allow you to sort of go into, without any knowledge of the system, look at the relationships between samples and how far apart they are and stuff like that. And those kind of approaches now, there's a few lines of code to be able to do this. And there's no proving right or wrong with this visualization. It just gives you a context to start looking at the systems, how different they are from each other. And once you have that, there's a bunch of ways to drill into the systems with a lot of tools that would make up a systems biology course with that. But I bring that up just because, I was never trained to look at. I was always trained to force everything into a two-dimensional plot, so it could fit into Gutenberg's advanced, system that is the PDF that fits on a rectangular screen, right? But now I train the students and everything, even though it's not like, hey, this is a systems biology component. It's like, well, let's look at the distributions of the numbers, and here are the relationships between the entities that we're trying to study, tumor samples or whatever. So to sort of frame the problem as a systems problem. And I find myself, as I've been doing this over the last few years, asking my students, what do I need to remove? This is probably from this DQC, experience or what other things we're doing. What genes do I need to remove to make things, the same on a plot where they come together or different? And just then again, it's kind of like a little bit of just, it's voodoo at this point, right? It's like college educated guess, educated voodoo. But then it's like laying the framework, Ken, with that plot and other tools, plus the compute power to go in and do computationally difficult things, and the basic coding that you need to be able to, implement a visualization tool or digging into it more deeply. And this is the stuff that was missing in the 70s, right? If there's systems theory out there, they didn't have the kind of computers we have today. And I wonder if, framing the problem, saying there's a problem, people realize there's a problem. How do you look at this from a reductionist approach? And then will that create this, the next renaissance, right? We don't have to have we can recapitulate the bad things of the past, but maybe we can recapitulate some of the good things of the past too, right? In history to be able to make this stuff happen. I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, you did. I think, and I'm interested in the application of some of Ken's really amazing ideas to the field of bioscience, and, climate science, and some of the things that are important to the biohacker community. And you mentioned one that I think is really important: the computational power, the data-intensive computing, the coding. These are all tools that can help people understand the complex systems more holistically with higher fidelity. Machine learning, you've published a paper, recently about the use of some machine learning technologies from Grand Theft Auto from video games,
Yeah.
in representing complex systems in cancer, et cetera. And so that brings us to the final question, Ken, we like to ask all our guests, which is, what is a biohacker to you?
I think a biohacker is somebody that merges traditional biology, which involves things such as test tubes and putting frogs in blenders and things like that, with some of this newfangled mathematics and computer science, which is how you analyze the data you get. It was not possible to do that before the days of computers. This is something new.
Yep.
And so that's how I would sort of describe it.
And earlier we talked about imaginary numbers being a hack, and some of the things that you're talking about, applying some new tools and theories and ideas to these overly complex systems like cancer and climate change, et cetera. And so biohackers, I think, are perfectly situated both in their ethos and their skill set to take some of your ideas and put them to good use. So this is a perfect vehicle for you to collaborate, and we appreciate you being part of the community.
Yeah, let me get an example of how this could be brought together with the scientific reports paper. You're trying to identify a cause for cancer, which in a traditional perspective would be a gene, and you just correct the gene and cancer goes away. What the paper showed is not a single gene. I think they identified 48 genes, transcripts actually, that correlate to the cancers. In terms of systems theory, what that says is that the question is, what genes cause cancer? It is not a deterministic question. It doesn't lead itself to a single gene. It lends itself to a collections of genes where different genes have different properties, or this one is dominant and this one's less dominant, and it's a probability distribution. So what it means in terms of my language is that the Nentropy of whatever solution you come up with cannot be zero. You cannot get a deterministic answer. But a entropy of 1 means every gene has the same probability of causing cancer. That's also ludicrous. So somewhere in the middle is where you're aiming for, but you don't quite know where. And the way to discover how to break that down is how low can you bring that normalized entropy down? And that'll characterize how accurate you can get. So that's an example of using the Nentropy. For the uncertainty is based upon a stochastic system called a complex random walk, which I won't go into today, but it has to do with predicting the future. And this is just a conjecture on my part right now, is when you're dealing with future events such as, will I get cancer? Will this person buy this object? That's a stochastic system, and that necessarily involves a formal model that is complex. In other words, it includes imaginary numbers, because the imaginary numbers bring some degree of uncertainty to it, which is what you have to have. When you bring uncertainty to it, you get different answers. So you need to bring that aspect. So I'm just giving you an example of how these new ideas can be applied to the problem in biology that you were trying to solve, in order to couch the problem in certain terms and try to describe how far you can get and different possible ways of getting there. Again, the mathematics is still undeveloped, but that's what one of your grad students is going to do one of these days.
Yeah.
One of the biohackers, not my grad student.
Nobel Prize out of it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Ken, you have been an absolute hoot, to use another 80s word. And thank you so much for participating. We've learned an incredible amount. I know the audience has as well. I'm going to, Alex, I'm going to ask you to give us closing comments. You got anything?
If you don't want to make your brain hurt, if you want to make your brain hurt, find somebody like Ken. But Ken's made my brain hurt more than anybody else I've ever known in my entire life, and I thank you for it. This stuff is hard, but I just feel like there's this. My final comment with it is, I think the things we're talking about here, there is an explosion about to happen. I think we're all trying to hold the trash compactor together in the Death Star, right? And there's a solution out there in the radio that's going to stop it, and we're going to go into a new renaissance that's going to impact all of human history and make everybody the quality of life better. And I feel like we're on the edge of that, right when we feel like we're about to die. It's all over. I think that the tools are all here, right? And tools get developed. It doesn't have to take as long as it took 500 years ago to make them happen. Tools can happen in a week now that it would take forever to develop before. So I just want to say I'm very optimistic about the future by embracing complexity and trying to do these things that I don't know how to do. I'm trying to figure it out. I think we're all trying to figure it out. And the misconception that people have figured this out is just a misconception. We're trying to figure this out.
It's always darkest before the dawn. Ken, how about you? Closing comments.
I agree with Alex. I think we're on the dawn of a new age that will be exciting beyond belief. Right now, everybody's stressed out for various reasons. And as Alex said, sometimes it's darkest before dawn. And again, if you believe in a system, our world society, our world culture is a system, and it has been stable basically since the Renaissance invented the city-state, politically stable, and now we're entering a new age. Think of all the virtual things that are happening. Corporations have to be in a building because people have to communicate with each other. That's not needed now.
That's not the case.
You have things like Uber overtaking taxi cabs or Airbnb taking over hotels. These are virtual organizations that exist in the ether. These are just the first instantiations of it. There's going to be many, many generations of Uber, the first generation of social networking, the Facebooks and Googles, Instagrams. They're going away. They're dying now. They will be replaced by a whole new generation, but I don't know what they're going to be. So this is just starting. So we are in the beginning of a new age of enlightenment, I think, far beyond what we experienced in the past. So, yeah, it's hard now, but I'm really optimistic about the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I share the same optimism. And if you all out there want to make sure that you stay on top of the age of enlightenment and all the cool new things that are happening, make sure to subscribe to the BioHackers podcast, wherever you enjoy your podcast, and on YouTube, because we're going to have more amazing guests just like Ken. Thank you so much to both of you, and cue the closing song.